Hello, it's week 5, and we just have this week coming up, plus 2 days next week. Well, probably until Wednesday, because you got to get my grading in and my grading done, and I'm behind, as you can tell. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the housekeeping things as usual, and then I'll talk about the 3 chapters for this week. You have some assignments coming due this week. You have a regular paper on Tuesday night, and then on Friday night at midnight, you'll have the advertising activity or an advertising paper that you make a choice between what you want to do with those. So let's go ahead and look at that so I don't take forever of your day watching this. I do want to let you know that I'm in the process of finishing the credibility papers. A number of you all have had them returned already. And so I'm working through those. I'll get those done in the next day or so, and you'll have those to go on for your last paper. The last paper is about audience analysis, and remember that I want you to keep in mind how important it is to know your audience. So this paper takes the audience and picks them apart. Now remember, all right, having a homogeneous audience is not always easy. So that is one of the big things. But you do aim for a target audience. You look at the demographics of that audience, the psychographics, as a lot of y'all are posting in your forum posts. How do you get the audience to identify with you? What would you do with that audience? So you can pick your audiences, right, for this. You can't always pick your audience in real life, but you can for this assignment. You're going to look for the things that bring them together, the common centers, any problems you see approaching them as a homogeneous audience, because no audience is ever completely homogeneous. And then any ethical issues you might run into because you're trying to adapt to that audience. I will tell you that I want you to refer back to your credibility papers, and that's why it's important for me to get them done. They take a little bit more time for me to grade than the first one did. So they are coming, all right? But you're going to want to refer back to those. And in fact, even on the handout for this assignment, I go back and re-include those things about the credibility paper that you wrote for me, all right? That's why it's a good idea to stick with the same topic, all right, unless I ask you to change it. There's one or two that I'm going, it's not really a persuasion topic. It's, not very consequential. We're looking for topics that make you think and deal with those kinds of things. So anyway, and if you're not sure, just run it by me. I've said that every time. The ones that I'm asking to change, it's like, you didn't run this by me. Oops. So anyway, you're going to refer back to the credibility, because credibility is so important with audience analysis, and then pick apart the audience. This one should take, take less effort than what you've already put in, but you've already put it into this. So that's another reason to stick with the same topic. Even those of you that change from the first one to this one, if you change it, if you stick with the one that you did for the second paper, you'll be fine. So, and then of course I'll be grading by looking at the credibility and audience analysis that you apply to this topic, and then of course your grammar, writing and discipline, and all that 9 yards again. So most of y'all are doing better so far. I mean, all I've graded, there's only one of you that I've taken off 5 points because you made the exact same mistakes I marked in the first paper. And remember, I said that in that announcement that I sent. I'm going to take points off if you're making the same mistakes that I've spent time going through your paper and marking and saying, don't do this, or do it this way, or whatever. So I will continue to take 5 points off for that. And yes, I open your first paper and have it there while I'm grading your second one. So, and we'll do that with the third as well. I'll have both papers open. I do want to make one more mention about a homogeneous audience issue. I want to point out that what I said about you all posting, even though you disagree with people, you post extremely well. All right. You don't go for, the kill on people because you disagree with their viewpoints. And that's an extremely important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about analyzing the audience. We're never going to have a completely homogeneous audience. You all have seen, you disagree about many things. You disagree about the president. Some of you all think he's doing a great job. Some of you all don't. You disagree about gun control. Some of you all think we should have stronger gun control. Some of you all think we should have no gun control. Abortion, the environment. There are all kinds of things that you all have had disagreements about in your forum posts, but none of you all has been out of bounds. I've not had to say remove a post or anything from anybody. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about good persuasion, being able to persuade people just simply by being understanding of that. So anyway, off my soapbox about dealing with a homogeneous audience, which we do not have in this class. So okay, that's the first paper. That's the first thing that's due. And then on Friday, at the end of the week, you're going to have an advertising paper to do. You make a choice. You do an advertising activity, all right? And you can choose whatever you want. It can be real or hypothetical, whatever. And you're going to create an advertisement for it, all right? You don't have to be an artist. You just need to be able to create an advertisement. You can explain it to me what you would think you would do in that advertisement. And then I want you to pick it apart as far as what we've talked about out of the advertising chapter. And that's why it's at the end of the week, because we're going to talk about the advertising chapter, all right, this week. And your other option, all right, not to create your own, but to take a campaign and analyze it and write up a paper about it. They're both, the descriptions are both there on the As You Learn site. We're talking about being able to look at how some other advertisers have tried to persuade you, or we're going to talk about how you, as an advertiser, would persuade people, right? So, and on that advertising activity, not every single little one of those things is going to apply, but there are going to be some that apply. So, everybody looks at it and goes, oh, I'm going to do the paper because I create my own. What out of those on the list that I gave you there applies? All right. So, and those are due a Friday at midnight. All right. And yes, I will be grading grammar. All right. And your ability to either, both are to analyze advertising, but analyze your own by building it, all right, or pick one that exists and analyze it. So if you have questions about that or you need help with that, you just let me know. The other thing, of course, you have forum post is up now for over the weekend, so November 14 is up, so you have 6 more to go. You have 4 more this coming week, and you'll have 2 next week. So those are the 6. Y'all are doing great on those. A number of y'all aren't posting them, but y'all are doing good on those. Don't forget, test is due Sunday at 5. Right? And I'm going to say this again. I know y'all are tired of hearing it, especially, and I have sent some back and said, please rephrase this. You don't just send me a paper and say, here it is, take it. I'm late. Here it is. No. You ask me if I'm willing to accept it. That's part of stratification of my being the professor and you being the student in the classroom. In order for you to be persuasive in all situations, you need to learn how to deal with doing that. So that's why I'm asking you not to tell me here's my paper, to ask me if I will accept your paper. I've not turned anybody down yet about accepting a paper. I have sent back and said, please rephrase this where you ask me if I will accept it. And by the way, it's not just you, it's my other class too. It isn't all, the millennials that are doing that. I have some non-traditional students in both of these classes, and some of them are not millennials, and they're doing the exact same thing. So please learn that. As part of learning to be in the working world, All right, following protocol is what that amounts to. Okay, I think that's it. The last activity will be the last week, and that's to analyze a persuasive speech. It's tied to chapter 13, and that will be next week. We only have the chapter in next week's, and that is the one on the persuasive speeches, and that activity has been posted. And where you upload it, that is not due, and I did not put the date, but it's due Wednesday, I believe. Oops, I clicked on, well, nobody's turned it in yet. What a surprise. I clicked on the wrong thing. Okay, let's see here. By noon on Wednesday the 7th. So that's the day after the last day of classes. That gives you a little bit of time. Your test for next week is still due Sunday because I'm not asking any questions out of the speech chapter, which is chapter 13. That material I will look at and grade based on your analysis of the public speech. Right. And yes, I give you a whole bunch there. You are not tied to those. If you know of another one, you're welcome to use it, but you need to be able to send me the link to it so I can watch it also. Okay. Nobody turned in any extra credit to me for the first half, and some of y'all might want to do some for the second half. That will be due Wednesday, August 7th at noon. It's too late to go back and do the first part, okay? And because, as you know, I'm behind and I would never catch up. So we're not, just the second half. I set them that way on purpose so that would happen. Okay, let's go look at chapter 10 first, which is about advertising. And this, of course, because this class is required of our advertising majors and is, you know, an important aspect of that is your writing and discipline class for this major. It's important to all of us, though. So it's not just the advertising majors that should pay attention to this chapter, because all of you all run into advertising. All right, so you're going to want to keep those things in the things that are in this chapter in mind. Talk more about psychographics. My question for today had to deal with psychographics. That's why I gave you an explanation, because I know it's in this upcoming chapter. But what about that? You know, what does psychographics deal with? What goes on in the brain and what sorts of things do people use? So that's an important aspect for you to pick up on out of this chapter. You know, they talk about what advertising is and how important it is to keep your name out in the public and how important mass media is to it. And then also to look at audiences again. So audience analysis comes back up here. So that's an important thing to do. All right. You know, keep in mind that there, in the PowerPoint, I go into more detail about how many different people who are advertisers have different approaches. So the approaches are important in advertising. So you'll want to pay attention to those. And then also the communication aspect of advertising. All right. Good section in the textbook about the psychology of advertising, things like motivation and how do you position a product. This is all not news to you all who are advertising majors. You've studied this in your advertising classes, all right? Positioning. What happens because we have an over-communicated society, and so things get lost in the muddle because we're over-communicated to. You know, people want to conform. The whole psychographics area of your attitudes, beliefs, opinions, and so forth. Anything you're selling that you're going to advertise, and that doesn't just mean product, folks. That means what if you're selling a person for a political campaign? So all of that comes into play there. So branding is an important aspect of that, giving name to something. I laugh about the examples in the textbook, and I talk some about it in the PowerPoint about the branding of the, Coca-Cola. Do you want a Coke? It's like, I'll never forget the first time I want to move to Shreveport, Louisiana. They said, "Do you want a Coke?" And I said, "Okay." And they said, "Well, what kind?" I said, "What do you mean, what kind? Coke is Coca-Cola." It's like, can you hand me a Kleenex? I just had a package here that is not Kleenex, but I would call it Kleenex. So I was like, okay, branding, naming. All right, pay attention to those. I want you to pay attention to the basic models of advertising. Psychological models, economic models, sociological models, and statistical models, because that's what advertisers use, all right, to persuade people. Now, yes, I know you learned about those in your advertising class, those of you all who are advertising majors, but how do those apply to the persuasive techniques we've been talking about for the past 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever we're in? I'm going to talk about stages and how you actually get your audience to participate. So you talk about levels of persuasion that go on, precipitation, which means like you're starting to think about it, the actual persuasion, reinforcing, reminding people. That's what a campaign does. You have more messages, and so it reminds people of whatever it is that person is advertising. You do need to keep in mind that there are some ethical issues always in advertising, things like false claims and false symbolism, and how people manipulate the technology that they're using to advertise. So important aspects of advertising there. Good discussion on how advertising actually works as psychological, as well as people working in the field and those kinds of things. And I know this is review for those of you that are advertising majors, but it's also important to look at, and it's important for all of us to look at, because we are so attuned to paying attention to people advertising to us. Good discussion about internet marketing and internet advertising. I mean, especially with social media today, as much as it is used. So make sure you pay close attention to that when you get to that. Good talk about contemporary advertising, how people advertise to the younger generation, younger than me, and how people advertise to the older generation, and people from the South and people from the North, how, the whole contemporary aspect of those. And then they talk about emotional appeals, transformative appeals, rational, functional appeals. These are how we appeal to the people that we're trying to sell our product to. Then there's a good discussion in this chapter about how do you actually critique ads. How do you pick them apart? Well, you're going to want to pay attention to that, because that's what I'm asking you to do for Friday's paper on the advertising activity, or the advertising paper. All right. And then a good discussion about deception in advertising. A good section about how do we advertise to children, how do we deal with how consumerism, or how consumeristic, I don't think that's a word, but how much consumerism we have in our society. And then the social effects of that. Especially things like appearance, that you've read a whole lot about how people appeal to teenage young women, all right, as far as advertising. We hear more about it with young women than we do about young men, but it applies to all. So freedom of speech, what are you allowed to say? What aren't you allowed to say? And then the public versus private interests are also important. It ends the chapter with a good discussion about what can you do. Those of you who are advertising majors and plan to go into the field, pay attention to those. Those of you who are not, but you are bombarded by advertisements, pay attention to those. One of the biggest issues is becoming media literate. So, and then there's some good suggestions in the textbook on that as well. So that is chapter 10. Chapter 11 has to deal with political persuasion, And we don't deal a whole lot with that in this class, although it is extremely important. I do want you to pay attention to the things that people do with political communication, political persuasion, not just advertising. Advertising is a part of that, but also how do you get people to think in political ways? You all have been discussing that well in forum posts. So, you know, what's important about political persuasion? All right. Most people would say the truth and honesty. Some people would not say that, okay? That getting people's attention is important, you know, polarization, getting your polarization issues, nasty issues, I say in some of my materials about, because we're seeing a lot of that lately. You know, one politician being nasty about the other, name calling, ad hominem arguments galore in political persuasion, which is very interesting to me because everything I've always been taught is that that is a fallacy and you don't use ad hominem. But look at political persuasion lately, all right? And, you know, we're coming up on a presidential campaign, so you're going to see more and more about it. This chapter talks about the language of politics, all right, the communication of politics, and the persuasion of politics. So, you know, that we use communication, you know, language, etc., persuasion, to get the message out there, to pass cultural values and political values on to others. All right, so language is extremely important. So good discussion in the textbook about language. Talk about short-term orientation and long-term orientation and objectives that a political campaign might have. Good discussion in the textbook, and you probably are well aware of this, is the mediated part of it. How much is media used to get the political message out? Because that's where we're bombarded the most with political persuasion. And political communication and persuasion is very audience-centered, so you have to pay attention to audience analysis. Pay attention to the ideology of a political campaign. What's their ideology? Are you choosing to be persuaded based on the ideology, or is it based on something else? All right, and so you're going to have to understand what your ideology is. Most of you all have said some of that in your papers or in your forum posts. So you have a good idea what your ideology is. So, and how is that affected? How does persuasion affect that? Also a section in this chapter on political socialization, how politics and political communication and political persuasion socialize us. And they do. You know, you all will carry on conversations with your friends and with your family. A couple of y'all have talked about how when you go with your family and your political position is completely opposite than Uncle John's, all right, then here's what happens. I just kind of shut down and don't say anything. Well, research would say that that's where the door opens for political persuasion to take place. But by the way, I'm like you. It's like, I don't want to talk about it. My brother-in-law is completely the other side of me, and I'm pretty middle of the road politically. So, but he's completely one of the ends of the spectrum. It's like, I just don't talk about it with him. My sister won't let him talk about it when I'm around. So it's kind of funny. It's like, well, because that's what political persuasion. You all have heard that before. You don't talk about religion, money, or politics at parties. Everybody does. So, and talks about the agents of political socialization, which means also political persuasion. You know, families, schools, religions, social peers, socials, situations, your peer networks, media. All right. And when we try to persuade in the political area, we do it, you know, interpersonally, person to person, a group to a person, a public speech situation. There are many different ways that we do it. There are different forms of political persuasion. We talk about administrative persuasion in the political realm, you know, setting the public agenda, building coalitions, which we see in the government. You know. And then legislative persuasion, which has to do with what we see going on in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Yeah. Then campaign persuasion. All right. Those of you who are advertising majors, this is where you come in here. All right. The actual campaign. All of us should come in because we need to be paying attention to what the advertisers are doing and the message that they're getting across. And also political persuasion in the context of entertainment. All right, most of y'all have seen Second City or perhaps Capital Steps. Those are two groups that turn political communication into humor. There's big studies being done now about how the late night talk hosts are talking too much about politics, supposedly under the guise of humor, but some people don't think they're very funny. So good discussions about that. I believe I gave you, I did give you some samples in Newbie's ad. You'll want to go watch that. It's really quite funny. They're all quite funny, but the ones that I gave you the links to in the PowerPoint. Significant effects model is an important thing to pay attention to in political persuasion. This is the model. It is, you know, that the political messages that you hear are going to have a great deal of effect. It's in contrast to what we call the limited effects model, where, you know, it's not going to do a whole lot. You know, there are messages that come on that aren't going to do a whole lot for me because of my ideology. But the significant effects model says, oh, there's a lot there that's I'm going to pay attention to. So, and then the whole trust issue of political persuasion. So, okay, the last chapter is chapter 12. It has to do with ethics and how important ethics are to persuasion. That's a no-brainer. All right. All of y'all have to take an ethics class. If you haven't taken one already, you're going to be taking one. All right. What is ethical? Now, the problem with ethics is that it varies from person to person. It's back to, like, we don't have a homogeneous audience. We also don't have a homogeneous approach to ethics. You know, most of us would say, don't lie, cheat, steal, or kill someone. All right. If you do, that's unethical. Right? But there are other things. So you'll want to look at that carefully. We go back to the Toolman model there, where when you make a claim and you back it up with evidence, that evidence is credible. So you see how it's all coming together here? All right. So it's like, so be ethical. When you get your evidence, make sure it isn't biased or prejudiced. You're always going to have a little bit of bias because that's what happens with materials that people do their own research on. We talk about a morality, a code of conduct, discerning right from wrong, do what's right, good, and appropriate, the textbook tells you. And so, of course, there's an action aspect of ethics. So as a persuader, you're going to want to pay attention to that. Moral virtue. Your values and ethics, all right, are not synonymous. So you're going to want to realize that. All right. All of us have a value system. Doesn't necessarily all of us are ethical when we use our value system. Right? So pay attention to what people's values and ethics are. Ethics, by the way, has long been historically. So there's a good discussion in the textbook about the historical aspects of studying ethics and persuasion. You know, about how accountability is important and sharing information is important. Free marketplace of ideas they talk about. So mostly here, what the materials in this chapter deal with are having you decide what your ethical standpoint is and what society's ethical standpoint is, and then somehow getting that together to be your ethical approach to things. And that's why some of y'all will disagree with some people's ethics, right? Very common. There'll be disagreement about what's ethical and what isn't. Well, one of the things you want to keep in mind is, where did you learn your ethics? All right, family, school, your religious upbringing, role models, celebrities, social institutions, etc. And then I want you to think in terms of how those for you might conflict with somebody else. All right, what their position is. We've seen some of that in the forum posts, that on the disagreeing points where you all have disagreed about things. And then the chapter ends with 5 approaches to ethics, your democracy, your democratic approach, humanitarian procedure, that you're following procedure, that there's a code of ethics and you follow that. Context, that's a tough one for me. Well, this is a situation, so contextually I can do that. And then narrative ethics is that's a newer form, the newest form of ethics that we try to deal with, and it's the most theoretical. It's basically the social drama, the storytelling part of the ethical approach. So when you think about the considerations for ethical communication, I want you to keep in mind that there are definitely basic procedures, and they're in the textbook in that chapter at the end of the text. And pay attention to areas of special concern for ethics: media, all right, new technology, social media, all right, journalism, news networks, politics and political comm, and then of course any public discourse, any public speaking. So, okay, well, those are the chapters for this week and the little housekeeping things at the beginning. I hope you all have a great week, and I'll be back making announcements and reminding you of things that are due. Keep your eyes open for the papers, the paper number 2. They are coming little bit by little bit. Have a great week. Bye.